5. October 6th, 1979. Don't let yourself get attached to anything. A guy told me one time, says organized crime boss Neil McCauley in Michael Mann's 1995 film Heat, don't let yourself get attached to anything you're not willing to walk out on in 30 seconds flat if you feel the heat around the corner. One of the easiest ways to grasp the differences between Fordism and post-Fordism is to compare Mann's film with the gangster movies made by Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese between 1971 and 1990. In Heat, the scores are undertaken not by families with links to the old country, but by rootless crews in an LA of polished chrome and interchangeable designer kitchens, of featureless freeways and late-night diners. All the local colour, the cuisine aromas, the cultural idiolects which the likes of The Godfather and Goodfellas depended upon have been painted over and refitted. Heat's Los Angeles is a world without landmarks, a branded sprawl where markable territory has been replaced by endlessly repeating vistas of replicating franchises. The ghosts of old Europe that stalked Scorsese and Coppola's streets have been exorcised, buried with the ancient beefs, bad blood, and burning vendettas somewhere beneath the multinational coffee shops. You can learn a great deal about the world of Heat from considering the name Neil McCauley. It is an anonymous name, a fake passport name, a name that is bereft of history, even as, ironically, it echoes the name of British historian Lord Macaulay. Compare Corleone, and remember that The Godfather was named after a village. Macaulay is perhaps the part that De Niro played that is closest to the actor's own personality. A screen, a cipher, depthless, icily professional, stripped down to pure preparation, research, method. I do what I do best. Macaulay is no mafia boss, no puffed-up chief perched atop a Baroque hierarchy governed by codes as solemn and mysterious as those of the Catholic Church and written in the blood of 1,000 feuds. His crew are professionals, hands-on entrepreneur speculators, crime technicians, whose credo is the exact opposite of Cosa Nostra family loyalty. Family ties are unsustainable in these conditions, as Macaulay tells the Pacino character, the driven detective, Vincent Hanna. Now, if you're on me and you gotta move when I move, how do you expect to keep a marriage? Hanna is Macaulay's shadow, forced to assume his insubstantiality, his perpetual mobility. Like any group of shareholders, Macaulay's crew is held together by the prospect of future revenue. Any other bonds are optional extras, almost certainly dangerous. Their arrangement is temporary, pragmatic, and lateral. They know that they are interchangeable machine parts, that there are no guarantees, that nothing lasts. Compared to this, the Goodfellas seem like sedentary sentimentalists, rooted in dying communities, doomed territories. The ethos espoused by Macaulay is the one which Richard Sennett examines in The Corrosion of Character, the personal consequences of work in the New Capitalism, a landmark study of the effective changes that the post-Fordist reorganization of work has brought about. The slogan which sums up the new conditions is "no long term." Where formerly workers could acquire a single set of skills and expect to progress upwards through a rigid organizational hierarchy, now they are required to periodically re-skill as they move from institution to institution, from role to role. As the organization of work is decentralized, with lateral networks replacing pyramidal hierarchies, a premium is put on flexibility. Echoing Macaulay's mockery of Hanna in Heat, how do you expect to keep a marriage? Sennett emphasizes the intolerable stresses that these conditions of permanent instability put on family life. The values that family life depends upon, obligation, trustworthiness, commitment, are precisely those which are held to be obsolete in the new capitalism. Yet, with the public sphere under attack and the safety nets that a nanny state used to provide being dismantled, the family becomes an increasingly important place of respite from the pressures of a world in which instability is a constant. The situation of the family in post-Fordist capitalism is contradictory, in precisely the way that traditional Marxism expected. Capitalism requires the family as an essential means of reproducing and caring for labor power, as a salve for the psychic wounds inflicted by anarchic social economic conditions. even as it undermines it, denying parents time with children, putting intolerable stress on couples as they become the exclusive source of effective consolation for each other. According to Marxist economist Christian Marazzi, the switch from Fordism to post-Fordism can be given a very specific date, October 6, 1979. It was on that date that the Federal Reserve increased interest rates by 20 points, preparing the way for the supply-side economics that would constitute the economic reality in which we are now enmeshed. The rise in interest rates not only contained inflation, it made possible a new organization of the means of production and distribution. The rigidity of the Fordist production line gave way to a new flexibility, a word that will send chills of recognition down the spine of every worker today. This flexibility was defined by a deregulation of capital and labor, with the workforce being casualized, with an increasing number of workers employed on a temporary basis, and outsourced. Like Sennett, Marazzi recognizes that the new conditions both required and emerged from an increased cybernetization of the working environment. The Fordist factory was crudely divided into blue and white-collar work, with the different types of labor physically delimited by the structure of the building itself. Laboring in noisy environments, watched over by managers and supervisors, workers had access to language only in their breaks, in the toilet, at the end of the working day, or when they were engaged in sabotage, because communication interrupted production. But in post-Fordism, when the assembly line becomes a flux of information, people work by communicating. As Norbert Wiener taught, communication and control entail one another. Work and life become inseparable. Capital follows you when you dream. Time ceases to be linear, becomes chaotic, broken down into punctiform divisions. As production and distribution are restructured, so are nervous systems. To function effectively as a component of just-in-time production, you must develop a capacity to respond to unforeseen events. You must learn to live in conditions of total instability, or precarity, as the ugly neologism has it. Periods of work alternate with periods of unemployment. Typically, you find yourself employed in a series of short-term jobs, unable to plan for the future. Both Marazzi and Sennett point out that the disintegration of stable working patterns was in part driven by the desires of workers. It was they who, quite rightly, did not wish to work in the same factory for 40 years. In many ways, the left has never recovered from being wrong-footed by capital's mobilization and metabolization of the desire for emancipation from Fordist routine. Especially in the UK, the traditional representatives of the working class, union and labour leaders, found Fordism rather too congenial. Its stability of antagonism gave them a guaranteed role. But this meant that it was easy for the advocates of post-Fordist capital to present themselves as the opponents of the status quo, bravely resisting an inertial organized labor, pointlessly invested in fruitless ideological antagonism, which served the ends of union leaders and politicians, but did little to advance the hopes of the class they purportedly represented. Antagonism is not now located externally, in the face-off between class blocks, but internally, in the psychology of the worker, who, as a worker, is interested in old-style class conflict, but, as someone with a pension fund, is also interested in maximizing the yield from his or her investments. There is no longer an identifiable external enemy. The consequence is, Marazzi argues, that post-Fordist workers are like the Old Testament Jews after they left the house of slavery, liberated from a bondage to which they have no wish to return, but also abandoned, stranded in the desert, confused about the way forward. The psychological conflict raging within individuals cannot but have casualties. Marazzi is researching the link between the increase in bipolar disorder and post-Fordism, and if, as Deleuze and Guattari argue, schizophrenia is the condition that marks the outer edges of capitalism, then bipolar disorder is the mental illness proper to the interior of capitalism. With its ceaseless boom and bust cycles, capitalism is itself fundamentally and irreducibly bipolar, periodically lurching between hyped-up mania, the irrational exuberance of bubble thinking, and depressive come-down. To a degree unprecedented in any other social system, capitalism both feeds on and reproduces the moods of populations. Without delirium and confidence, capital could not function. It seems that with post-Fordism, the invisible plague of psychiatric and affective disorders that has spread, silently and stealthily, since around 1750, i.e. the very onset of industrial capitalism, has reached a new level of acuteness. Here, Oliver James's work is important. In The Selfish Capitalist, James points to significant rises in the rates of mental distress over the last 25 years. By most criteria, James reports, rates of distress almost doubled between people born in 1946, age 36 in 1982, and 1970, age 30 in 2000. For example, 16% of 36-year-old women in 1982 reported having trouble with nerves, feeling low, depressed, or sad, whereas 29% of 30-year-olds reported this in 2000. For men, it was 8% in 1982, 13% in 2000. Another British study James cites compared levels of psychiatric morbidity, which includes neurotic symptoms, phobias, and depression, in samples of people in 1977 and 1985. Whereas 22% of the 1977 sample reported psychiatric morbidity, this had risen to almost a third of the population, 31%, by 1986. Since these rates are much higher in countries that have implemented what James calls selfish capitalism than in other capitalist nations, James hypothesizes that it is selfish, i.e., neoliberalized capitalist policies and culture, that are to blame. Specifically, James points to the way in which selfish capitalism stokes up both aspirations and the expectations that they can be fulfilled. In the entrepreneurial fantasy society, the delusion is fostered that anyone can be Alan Sugar or Bill Gates. Never mind that the actual likelihood of this occurring has diminished since the 1970s. A person born in 1958 was more likely than one born in 1970 to achieve upward mobility through education, for example. The selfish capitalist toxins that are most poisonous to well-being are the systematic encouragement of the ideas that material affluence is the key to fulfillment, that only the affluent are winners, and that access to the top is open to anyone willing to work hard enough, regardless of their familial, ethnic, or social background. If you do not succeed, there is only one person to blame. James's conjectures about aspirations, expectations, and fantasy fit with my own observations of what I have called hedonic depression in British youth. It is telling, in this context of rising rates of mental illness, that New Labour committed itself, early in its third term in government, to removing people from incapacity benefit, implying that many, if not most, claimants are malingerers. In contrast with this assumption, it doesn't seem unreasonable to infer that most of the people claiming incapacity benefit, and there are well in excess of 2 million of them, are casualties of capital. A significant proportion of claimants, for instance, are people psychologically damaged as a consequence of the capitalist realist insistence that industries such as mining are no longer economically viable. Even considered in brute economic terms, though, the arguments about viability seem rather less than convincing, especially once you factor in the cost to taxpayers of incapacity and other benefits. Many have simply buckled under the terrifyingly unstable conditions of post-Fordism. The current ruling ontology denies any possibility of a social causation of mental illness. The chemico-biologization of mental illness is, of course, strictly commensurate with its depoliticization. Considering mental illness an individual chemico-biological problem has enormous benefits for capitalism. First, it reinforces capital's drive towards atomistic individualization. You are sick because of your brain chemistry. Second, it provides an enormously lucrative market in which multinational pharmaceutical companies can peddle their pharmaceuticals. We can cure you with our SSRIs. It goes without saying that all mental illnesses are neurologically instantiated, but this says nothing about their causation. If it is true, for instance, that depression is constituted by low serotonin levels, what still needs to be explained is why particular individuals have low levels of serotonin. This requires a social and political explanation, and the task of repoliticizing mental illness is an urgent one if the left wants to challenge capitalist realism. It does not seem fanciful to see parallels between the rising incidence of mental distress and new patterns of assessing workers' performance. We will now take a closer look at this new bureaucracy.